Oh my God.
You've seen people get mocked for doing the right thing. You've watched communities laugh at kindness they don't understand. But what if the biggest joke in your town was actually the most beautiful act of sacrifice? What if the man everyone ridiculed for dragging that old chimney through the dirt was the only one brave enough to help? This is the story of a cowboy, a tired donkey, and a community that forgot how to recognize a hero when he was walking right past them. The morning sun had not yet burned through the valley dust when Marcus lifted the broken chimney pieces onto his wooden cart. It was a Tuesday in late October, and the entire town of Riverside seemed to pause in their morning routines to watch what the old rancher was doing. He worked quietly, his weathered hands moving with the kind of certainty that only comes from decades of doing difficult things without asking for permission or praise. His donkey, a gray creature named Scout with white patches across her aging face, stood patiently beside him. She had seen 43 years pass, which made her older than most marriages in Riverside. Her ribs showed through her coat, and her breath came in steady, measured pulls. She was not the kind of animal you would choose for heavy work. She was the kind of animal you kept because she had nowhere else to go. The chimney had been pulled from old Mrs. Eleanor's farmhouse just 3 days before. It had collapsed inward during the night, a structure that had stood for nearly 80 years, finally giving way to age and gravity and the relentless way that time breaks everything we build. Eleanor was 87 years old. She lived alone except for her cat, and she did not have the money to have the debris professionally removed. The contractor who had come to assess the damage had quoted her $400. $400. Eleanor had looked at the number on the paper he handed her and had smiled in the way people smile when they are making peace with impossible things. Marcus had driven his truck past Eleanor's property on Wednesday morning. He saw the rubble scattered across her front yard, the great stones that had once been part of her home now broken into pieces, some of them the size of a man's head. He had seen Eleanor standing on her porch in her garden coat, the one with the frayed sleeves, staring at the damage the way you might stare at a scar you cannot hide. He had not stopped. He had driven on to tend his own small ranch, a place that held barely enough cattle to justify the work. But he had thought about Eleanor's porch and that expression on her face, and Thursday morning he had come back. The neighbors had begun to notice by Friday. Martha Chun, who lived across the road with her 2 adult sons, had called over to ask him what he was doing. Marcus had explained that he was going to remove the chimney pieces and take them to the recycling facility outside of town. It was a 2-hour drive one way. Martha had nodded and gone back inside. By the time Marcus had loaded the first pieces of the chimney onto his cart, using Scout to help him drag the heaviest sections, Martha was on her front porch again. This time she was not alone. She had come out with her sons, and they were pointing, not at the work, at Scout, at the way the old donkey's legs trembled slightly as she pulled against the rope. The laughter had started quietly. A man passing on his bicycle had slowed down and shaken his head, amused by the sight of a cowboy using an ancient donkey to haul rubble. By Saturday, when Marcus had made his second trip and was preparing for the third, there were more people watching. Someone from town had posted a photo on social media. An old man with an old donkey dragging what looked like pieces of a demolished building, and the caption was simple, "Only in Riverside." There were comments underneath. Some were playful, some were cruel. Someone had asked if Marcus had lost his truck. Someone else had asked if he had lost his mind. A third person, a woman who did not live in Riverside, but had seen the photo because she followed the town's community page, had written, "This is why people leave small towns." This is exactly why. Marcus had continued his work without acknowledging any of it. He woke before dawn, hitched Scout, and worked until noon. Eleanor had come out on Saturday morning with a thermos of coffee and fresh biscuits. She had watched him work, and she had cried quietly, not speaking, just standing with her hands folded in front of her, in the way that people stand when they are witnessing something that matters more than anything that has happened to them in a long time. Marcus had accepted the coffee and the biscuits and had eaten them while sitting on the edge of his cart. Scout had stood beside him, her old head drooping slightly, her breathing steady and patient. Sunday, there were at least 30 people who had come to watch at some point during the day. They lined the road. They took photographs. Some smiled. Some frowned. Some looked confused by what they were seeing, as though the act of removing debris from a neighbor's yard was something so foreign to their understanding of community that they had to look at it like zoologists studying an animal they did not recognize. The teenagers who lived in the neighborhood had started to gather in small groups, and their laughter was the kind of laughter that young people make when they see something that seems foolish to them. A grown man, an old donkey, pieces of broken stone. No money changing hands, no sense made of it. Marcus did not stop. He had loaded nearly 3 tons of chimney rubble by the end of Sunday. His back ached in the way that only physical work can make it ache, a deep and honest pain that ran through his muscles and bones. Scout's legs were shaking more noticeably by the end of each day. Her eyes had taken on that distant look that old animals get when they are tired beyond the kind of tired that sleep can fix. But they kept going, both of them, as though they had made a promise to each other that did not need to be spoken out loud, as though the world's laughter was simply noise that happened in the background of something real. Eleanor watched from her porch, and sometimes she came out and walked beside them, not helping, just being there. Being a witness to the fact that someone had cared enough to help her, that someone thought she was worth it.
Monday morning broke gray and cold, the kind of morning that comes to mountain valleys when fall is beginning to forget it is beautiful and is starting to remember it is dying. The temperature had dropped to 48 degrees, and there was a dampness in the air that made everything feel heavier than it actually was. The sky was the color of old concrete, and the sun, when it finally appeared, was weak and pale and offered almost no warmth. This was the day that changed how people saw what was happening. Scout was trembling when Marcus led her from the barn. It was not just her legs anymore. Her entire body seemed to be vibrating slightly, as though her old frame was a machine that had been run beyond its design limits. Her breathing was shallow and quick, faster than it had been the days before. Her eyes had lost some of their light, that inner glow that even old animals carry when they still have their will intact. She was still willing. Her legs still moved forward when Marcus gently pulled her toward the cart. But it was the kind of willingness that comes from love or loyalty rather than strength. Her gray coat, usually relatively clean, was now caked with dust from the work of the past 3 days. There were streaks in the dust where her sweat had run down, creating patterns like cracks in old leather. Her white patches seemed smaller somehow, as though her aging was accelerating with each trip. Marcus's face told a different story than his body did. His body was efficient, his movements practiced and certain, the way an experienced rancher moves when he is doing work that his muscles remember even when his mind is tired. But his face was the map of someone carrying weight that no rope could transfer to a cart. He was 59 years old, but he looked older in that gray light. His jaw was tight, the muscles working beneath the skin as though he was grinding something down inside himself. There were deep lines running down from his eyes, lines that you only get from decades of squinting in the sun and weather. His hands, when he hitched Scout to the cart, were shaking very slightly. Not from cold, for something else. His lips were compressed into a thin line, and when he breathed out, you could see his breath in the morning air, white clouds that disappeared as quickly as they formed. Eleanor was waiting for him when he arrived at her property. She had been waiting since before dawn. Her neighbor, a woman named Sarah who had not laughed at Marcus's work, but had instead observed it with something like understanding, had told her later that Eleanor had come out to her porch at 5 in the morning. She had stood there in the darkness for nearly 2 hours, just watching the road, waiting for the cart and the old donkey and the man who was helping her. When Marcus finally came into view, moving slowly down the road, Eleanor had made a sound. It was something between a sob and a gasp. She was wearing the same garden coat, the one with the frayed sleeves. She had added a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, a quilt that was clearly very old, with stitching that had faded to almost nothing. She looked smaller than she had on previous days. Or perhaps she was just standing differently, with less weight in her posture, as though something inside her had shifted. The remaining chimney pieces were fewer now. There were perhaps 30 or 40 more, scattered across her front yard like gray and red bones. Some were small enough to hold in both hands. Some were large, shaped like broken teeth or fragments of ancient pottery. Eleanor had organized them while waiting for Marcus, creating piles that made the work easier. This small act of preparation, done by an 87-year-old woman in the cold darkness, spoke to something deeper than gratitude. It was respect. It was an understanding of what another person needed to do their work well. By 8 in the morning, people began to gather again. But this time, something was different. The tone of the watching was different. There was a woman named Jennifer who had laughed on the first day, who had made a joke to her husband about the old man and his old donkey. She came that morning with her 7-year-old daughter, who was standing beside her watching Marcus work. The girl was watching Scout. Her small face was turned toward the donkey with an expression that children sometimes get, an expression of pure and uncomplicated concern. She was watching Scout's breathing, watching the way the donkey's legs moved, watching the tremors that ran through her body. The girl had asked her mother a question that was quietly devastating in its simplicity. She had asked, "Is she okay?" Jennifer had not answered immediately. She had looked at her daughter, then at Scout, then at Marcus, whose face was still holding that impossible weight. Then she had picked up her daughter and walked her back inside without answering. The cold had intensified as the day went on. By noon, it had begun to drizzle, a fine cold rain that soaked slowly through everything it touched. Marcus did not stop working. He adjusted Scout's halter to be more comfortable. He checked her hooves and her legs. He spoke to her in low tones, words that were barely audible, words that seemed to be coming from a place very deep in his chest. Scout continued. They both continued. But now the watching crowd had changed. There were still people who found some version of amusement in what they were seeing. But there were others who had returned with different intentions. An older man named Robert, who had not left his house in 3 months due to depression and illness, had come out and was standing on his front porch watching. He was crying, though he seemed unaware of it. A mother with 3 children was standing at her mailbox, watching Marcus work. Her children were quiet, in that way that children become quiet when they are witnessing something that their young intuition tells them matters. Eleanor brought out a blanket before 1 o'clock. It was a different blanket than the one she was wearing, a thicker one, and she gently arranged it across Scout's back and chest, tucking it around the donkey's legs as best she could while the animal stood in the rain. She brought water. She brought hay. She brought warmth because it was the only thing she had to give. And Marcus accepted these small kindnesses, and Scout stood in the rain with her new blanket, and the gray morning turned into a gray afternoon, and something in the town of Riverside began to shift. It happened on Tuesday afternoon, around 2 o'clock, when the sun was starting its descent, and the valley was filling with that particular kind of light that happens in the afternoon of mountain country in the fall. The light was coming from the side, making long shadows of everyone and everything, and it made the scene look like something captured in an old photograph. Everything slightly less real than usual. Scout had been working for 5 hours. She had hauled perhaps 2 tons of stone already that day, and there were still many pieces remaining in Eleanor's yard. Marcus had decided that this would be the final day. He had made a calculation sometime in the early morning, figuring the weight and the remaining pieces and the condition of the donkey, and he had determined that if they pushed hard, if they kept going without stopping, they could finish by evening. After that, the remaining small pieces could be loaded by hand or left for Eleanor to manage gradually. The heavy work would be done. What happened was simple and profound and changed the way everyone in Riverside understood what they had been witnessing. Scout was pulling a particularly large piece of the chimney, a section that weighed perhaps 50 pounds and was awkwardly shaped. She was moving slowly, her body bent low, her old legs shaking with each step. Marcus was walking beside her, speaking to her in those low tones he always used, words of encouragement or perhaps simply words of presence. The rope was taut between them, the wooden cart rattling slightly behind the donkey. And Scout stopped. She simply stopped. Her front legs went rigid, and her rear legs began to buckle underneath her. Marcus immediately stopped pulling, immediately reached for the rope. He was making a sound, a kind of urgent and anguished sound, something between a command and a prayer. Scout's eyes were wide, and her breathing had become very shallow. For a moment that lasted much longer than a moment, it seemed like the old donkey was going to collapse right there on the road, in front of everyone, in front of the sky and the gray stone and the watching town. But she didn't collapse. Instead, she did something else. She gathered herself. You could see her gathering herself, could see the effort moving through her old body. Her legs straightened beneath her. Her breathing steadied. And then, slowly, with the kind of deliberation that an athlete uses when they are pushing past their limits, she moved forward. One step, then another, then another. The stone moved forward with her. The ropes slackened slightly, then went taut again, and they continued. The people who were watching could not look away. There was a woman named Catherine, a high school English teacher, who later told someone that in that moment she had witnessed something that changed the way she understood courage and loyalty. There was an older man named Thomas who had been one of the people who had laughed initially, who had joked about the foolishness of the scene. He was standing on his porch when it happened, and he did not move for nearly 5 minutes afterward. He simply stood there, watching Scout and Marcus continue their work, and his face was processing something that his mind was struggling to understand. By the time Scout finished that day, the people of Riverside were not watching a joke anymore. They were watching a kind of grace, though they might not have called it that. They were watching a refusal to abandon someone in need. They were watching a commitment that had nothing to do with sense or reason or self-interest. They were watching an old donkey who by every measure should have simply laid down and given up, instead choosing to push forward. And they were watching a man who loved that donkey so much that he had made every step of this journey as easy as possible for her, even though the journey was tearing at something inside him that had very little left to give. That evening, a truck pulled up to Eleanor's property. It was driven by Robert Chun, Martha's husband, the man whose wife had laughed on the first day. He had come with his 2 adult sons. Without asking permission, without speaking to Marcus or Eleanor, they simply began loading stone. They loaded for an hour, moving with the kind of efficiency that 3 younger and stronger men can bring to a task. They did not say anything about why they had come. They did not make a show of it. They simply worked, and when the light was nearly gone from the sky, they left. Another truck came the next morning. This one was driven by Jennifer, the woman whose daughter had asked if Scout was okay. She had come with her neighbors, 3 women who had also initially been amused by what they were seeing. They worked for 2 hours. They brought coffee and sandwiches. They brought blankets for Scout. By noon, they had finished the job. But Marcus, standing beside Scout on Eleanor's property, watching other people finish the work that he and his old donkey had started, was not smiling. He was looking at Scout, studying the way the donkey's legs were still shaking, the way her head hung lower than it had even a few days before. He was understanding, in a way that was becoming unavoidable, that his beautiful donkey had given everything she had to give for this work. The cost had been high. The cost had been paid not in money, but in the years that Scout would no longer have, in the health that she had burned through, in the reserve that old animals carefully maintain in order to survive another winter. Eleanor, standing nearby, was understanding the same thing. She had not asked Marcus to do this work. She had not asked him to sacrifice his donkey's health and strength. But she had accepted it, and that acceptance itself was a weight that she would carry for the rest of her life. 2 weeks after the last stone had been removed from Eleanor's yard, Margaret, who was the librarian in Riverside and who knew everyone's history like other people know the contents of their homes, was working at a circulation desk when Marcus came in to return a book. This was unusual. Marcus did not come to the library often. But on this particular Tuesday afternoon, he came and he stood at the desk and he asked Margaret if she had any records about people who had lived in Riverside over 30 years ago. Margaret had asked him which specific years, and Marcus had answered with precision, 1993 and 1994. Margaret pulled the records, and she had shown Marcus something that very few people in the current town of Riverside knew. In 1993, a young woman named Sarah had lived in the small cottage that was now Eleanor's farmhouse. Sarah had been married to a man named David, and they had had a young son. That young son had fallen very ill in the winter of 1994, a sudden illness that the doctors could not immediately identify. While the child was in the hospital in the nearest city, 3 hours away, a storm had come to Riverside. It had been a severe winter storm, the kind that comes once every 100 years, with snow that blocked the roads and wind that knocked down trees and power lines. Sarah's husband David had become worried. Their son was in the hospital, and the roads were blocked, and no one could reach them or bring them news. In desperation, David had gathered their animals and supplies, determined to walk through the snow to the road that was not blocked to find a way to get to his son. He had taken his horse, a mare named Scout that they had owned for several years, and Scout had carried him through the snow and wind and cold for nearly 12 miles until he reached the main highway. The horse had then stood with him for another hour until a passing police officer had picked him up and driven him to the hospital. The boy had survived his illness. The horse, named Scout, had developed pneumonia from her exposure to the storm, but she had recovered, and she had lived. David had never forgotten what that horse had done for him, had never forgotten the willingness with which she had walked into danger because she was asked to. Scout became sacred to him. She was not a horse anymore. She was a reminder of the night that his faith had been tested and found that there were forces in the world beyond his understanding that sometimes answer prayers. 20 years later, David had died suddenly of a heart attack. His wife Sarah had followed him 3 years after that. Their son, who had survived the illness of his childhood, had moved away to the city and had not returned to Riverside. The cottage had been rented out and then eventually sold, and it had become Eleanor's home. But the story did not end there, because Sarah had asked one thing of her son before she died. She had asked him to find Scout, to make sure that the horse was cared for. The boy, now a man, had done something about that, and his search had led him to Marcus. Scout had belonged to Marcus for nearly 25 years. She had lived on his ranch, and she had been cared for by him with a kind of tenderness that you only show an animal that you know carries a story greater than itself. When Eleanor's chimney had collapsed, Marcus had understood something about the universe that most people never understand. He had understood that he was being asked to close a circle. Eleanor was now living in the house where Scout's greatest act had occurred. Eleanor was now the person who needed help in the same way that David had needed help all those years ago. And Scout, the child of the storm, the horse who had saved a life, was being asked one more time to help save someone. Margaret had watched Marcus's face as he had processed this information, as he had understood the implications of what she was telling him. She had watched something like acceptance move across his features, something like peace. He had thanked her and had left the library without saying anything else. But that was not the end of the story either, because Eleanor, in her way, had been understanding pieces of this truth without being told it explicitly. She had noticed something about Scout, some quality that went beyond the normal relationship between a human and an animal. She had seen the way Marcus touched Scout, the way he spoke to her, the way he had made sure that her comfort was prioritized above the efficiency of the work. Eleanor, who was lonely and who had lived without family for many years, had recognized what Scout meant to Marcus. And so, when Scout had begun to fail, when her health had started to decline in the weeks following the completion of the work, Eleanor had made a decision. She had come to Marcus's ranch on a cold November morning, and she had asked him if she could help him care for Scout. Marcus had understood immediately what she was offering. She was offering to share the burden. She was offering to be present for the ending that was coming. Marcus had said yes, and from that day forward, Eleanor would come to the ranch 3 times a week. She would groom Scout and feed her and spend time with her. She would sit with her in the pasture, and she would tell her stories about Eleanor's own life, about the people she had loved and lost. And Scout, in that way that old animals have, would listen. The people of Riverside, watching this develop over the following months, would begin to understand what had really happened when Marcus had dragged those chimney stones down the road. They would understand that it had never been about the rubble. It had been about love. It had been about a man honoring the life of an animal who had saved someone he cared about. It had been about completing a circle that had begun in a winter storm 25 years before. It had been about what one living creature owed to another, and how that debt was paid not with words but with actions. Scout died on a Wednesday in March, almost 5 months after the work on Eleanor's chimney had been completed. She died in the late afternoon, in the pasture where she had spent the best years of her life, with Marcus on one side of her and Eleanor on the other. Both of them were holding her, their hands gentle against her old body, their words soft and steady as she made her transition from one form of existence to another. When it was finished, when Scout had taken her last breath and her old body had finally stopped carrying the weight of 73 years and all the love that had been placed upon her, they remained there. They did not move. They simply bore witness to what they had just lost. The people of Riverside found out the next day. The news spread through the town, not with laughter or mockery, but with a quiet kind of sadness that people felt in their chests. Several people came to Marcus's ranch to pay their respects. They brought food, the way people do when they do not know what else to do in the presence of grief. Jennifer came with her daughter, the little girl who had asked if Scout was okay. The girl asked Marcus if he wanted to see something, and she pulled out a drawing that she had made. It was a picture of Scout, rendered in colored pencil by a 7-year-old hand, imperfect and beautiful. It showed Scout pulling the cart through the rain, and it showed Marcus beside her, and it showed the sky above them. But what was most striking was the expression that the child had captured in Scout's eyes. There was determination there, yes, but there was also something that transcended determination. There was love. Eleanor attended the small gathering that Marcus held to remember Scout. She brought with her a gift, something that she had been working on for weeks without telling anyone. It was a small book, handmade, with pages of sketches. Eleanor was not an artist in any formal sense. Her drawings were simple, the kind that an 87-year-old woman might create if she had spent her life in other pursuits. But what the sketches contained was something that no professional could have captured. They were a visual record of Scout's last 5 months. There was a sketch of Scout standing in the winter pasture with snow on her back. There was a sketch of Scout's face, drawn from very close, showing the gentleness in her eyes. There was a sketch of Marcus and Scout together, the two of them inseparable. There was a sketch of Eleanor feeding Scout from her hands. There was a sketch of the three of them together in the barn on a cold night, all of them facing the same direction, looking out at something beyond the frame of the drawing. The final sketch was dated the day before Scout had died. It showed Scout lying in the pasture, and Marcus and Eleanor sitting beside her, and the sky filled with stars. The drawing was titled "The Gift That Gave Everything." When Marcus saw the sketches, he wept, not from grief, though there was plenty of that, but from the understanding that his love for this animal and Eleanor's respect for that love had been witnessed and recorded and transformed into something permanent. The sketches would outlive him. They would outlive Eleanor. They would exist as testimony to the fact that Scout had mattered, that her life had meant something, that her final act of service had been recognized and honored. Over the following months, something remarkable happened in Riverside. The story of Marcus and Scout and Eleanor began to change the way people treated each other. It was not a dramatic change, not the kind of thing that would make the news or seem impressive to an outsider. But it was real. When Maria's roof was damaged in a spring storm, 3 men she barely knew came and helped her repair it without asking for payment. When the school needed volunteers for the playground renovation, nearly 40 people signed up. When old John's truck broke down, the entire neighborhood came together to raise money for the repairs. The kindness did not originate from Marcus's example. Exactly. But it was as though his willingness to serve without recognition had given people permission to be kind without the expectation of reward. Eleanor established a small scholarship in the name of Scout, money that would help young people in Riverside pursue education in veterinary science or animal care. The scholarship was modest, but it was meaningful, and it ensured that Scout's name would be remembered by the next generation as someone who had mattered, who had served, who had loved. Marcus continued his work on his small ranch. He did not acquire another donkey. He did not seek any recognition for what he had done. He simply continued to live with the same quiet dignity that had characterized his entire life. But something had shifted in him as well. He began to volunteer at the local animal shelter. He began to teach young people about animal care and the responsibilities that come with owning a creature that cannot speak for itself. He became, in his way, a quiet teacher of what it means to honor a commitment, even when that commitment is costly, even when that commitment is not understood or appreciated at first. Years later, when people told the story of the cowboy who had dragged the chimney with his donkey, the story had transformed. It was no longer a story about foolishness. It was a story about love. It was a story about what one person could do when they understood that another living being was worth sacrificing for. It was a story about how small acts of service could change a community, could transform strangers into neighbors, could remind people that kindness was not weakness, but the greatest strength. Eleanor lived to be 94 years old. When she died, peacefully in her sleep in her farmhouse with the rebuilt chimney standing tall and strong above her, her obituary mentioned the sketches. It mentioned Scout. It mentioned Marcus. It told the story of the work that had been done on a cold autumn, and it explained what that work had really meant. The obituary ended with Eleanor's own words, words that she had written toward the end of her life. I came to Riverside late in my life, thinking I would simply wait out my remaining years. But I was given a gift I never expected. I was given the privilege of witnessing true love. I was given the honor of knowing a horse who taught me what it means to give everything. I was given a neighbor who understood that sometimes the most important work we do is the work that no one is watching, the work that we do simply because it is right. Scout never ran again after that autumn, but she never feared humans either, and neither did I. In the end, the sketch told a different story than the initial laughter had suggested. The sketch showed that the cowboy and the donkey had been engaged in the most important work of all. The sketch showed that love is always worth its cost. The sketch showed that when we think we are laughing at someone for their foolishness, we might actually be witnessing someone's greatest wisdom. The people of Riverside learned this. They learned it slowly, but they learned it. And the lesson stayed with them, and it changed them, and it spread from them to others. And it became part of the story of their town, the story they told about who they were and what they valued and what they believed was worth doing, even when no one was watching.